Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. We got a bunch of requests from you guys to dig into the Sri Lankan presidential election, so that's what we're going to do. We've got excerpts from Wikipedia about the actual election and this fascinating article from Al Jazeera analyzing the results.
Yeah, this election is really shaking things up over there.
For real, just saying the name Inder Kumara Dissanayake out loud, most people probably wouldn't know who that is.
Right.
But now he's the president. That's got to be huge.
Absolutely huge. It really upsets the balance of power that's been in place in Sri Lanka for decades.
What do you mean?
So for the longest time, Sri Lankan politics has been dominated by two main parties. The Sri Lanka Freedom Party, or SLFP, and the United National Party, or the UNP.
Okay, I've heard of them.
Yeah, they've been the big players for as long as anyone can remember. Dissanayakis from the third party, the Janatha Vimukti Peramona, the JVP for short.
And they just came out of nowhere to win.
It seemed that way, right? No one really expected them to be able to break through like this.
So what's the JVP all about then? Why is this such a big deal?
Well, their history is rooted in Marxist and leftist ideology.
Whoa, okay.
Yeah, they were even behind a couple of insurrections back in the 1970s and the late 1980s.
So they were considered a pretty radical party.
Exactly.
So for Dissanayake with that background to become president, that's a pretty big shift. Did Sri Lanka just suddenly become like a radical leftist country? What happened?
Not quite. While the JVP had that history, Dissanayake himself has been really strategic about how he's been presenting himself and his policies.
You mean like he's toned it down?
Exactly. Especially on the economic front. He's really toned down the rhetoric and focused on issues that appeal to a much broader base of voters.
Which makes sense given what Sri Lanka's been through lately, right?
Exactly.
I mean, we all remember that economic crisis back in 2022. It was all over the news, shortages, protests, even the previous president having to flee the country. Crazy.
It was a mess, and it really left a mark on Sri Lankan voters. There was, and I think still is, so much frustration and anger toward those established parties, the SLFP and the UNP. A lot of people blame them for the whole mess. Dissanayake was able to tap into that anger, that desire for something different.
So he was like the anti-establishment candidate.
Exactly. A clean break from the same old, same old.
And it worked. He won. But didn't he not get like a majority of the votes right away?
That's right. The sources mentioned he didn't get a clear majority, so they had to go to a second round of counting, which is pretty rare in Sri Lankan elections.
It is.
Yeah, it almost never happens. And it's that second round where they factor in what they call second preference votes that you really see just how much things have changed. It wasn't just like a protest vote against the big parties. There's a real appetite for change that goes way beyond the usual party lines.
So Dissanayak's the president, but he's kind of walking this tightrope, right? I mean, on the one hand, you've got his party's history, but on the other hand, he needs to appeal to, like, everyone if he wants to actually get stuff done.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in, for sure. And on top of all that, the economy is still a major issue. Remember that crisis back in 22? People are looking to him to fix that mess, which is a tall order.
Yeah, no kidding. So what's his plan? Did his campaign actually say how they were going to actually fix things?
Well, he made a lot of promises on the campaign trail. Tackling corruption was a big one.
Makes sense. That was a huge source of anger during the whole economic crisis, right?
Exactly. And he also talked about, like, reducing the tax burden on everyday Sri Lankans.
Okay, so typical campaign promises, help the people, get rid of corruption. Anything more concrete?
Well, that's where things get interesting. See, he also agreed to a deal with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund.
Ah, the IMF. Always a catch with those guys, isn't there?
Right. They give you money, but they want something in return. In this case, it's a $3 billion loan, which Sri Lanka desperately needs to stabilize the economy. But the catch is...
Don't leave me hanging. What's the catch?
The IMF wants some pretty serious austerity measures in return.
So Dissanayake is stuck between a rock and a hard place here. He needs to keep the IMF happy to fix the economy, but he also needs to keep all those promises he made to the Sri Lankan people, you know, the ones who are already struggling.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the political situation. Remember, he doesn't actually have a majority in parliament.
That's right. That's why they had that second round of voting.
Yeah. He needs to find a way to build alliances, get people on his side if he wants to get anything done. The next parliamentary elections are coming up in November, and those are going to be a real test for him.
Man, it's like he won the election, but the real battle's just beginning.
That's one way to put it.
Okay, so we've talked about the economy, the political challenges, But isn't there another layer to this? Like, what about the ethnic tensions in Sri Lanka? I know it's a complicated issue with a long history, but can you kind of bring us up to speed?
Sure, sure. Okay, so basically, Sri Lanka has had multiple ethnic groups, living there for centuries. The two biggest are the Sinhalese. They make up like 75% of the population. And then there's the Tamils, about 15%.
And there's been tension between these groups.
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to religion. The Sinhalese are mostly Buddhist. The Tamils are mostly Hindu.
And this tension's been going on for, like, ever.
Well, it goes way back, but British colonial policies definitely didn't help. And in 1983, it just exploded into a full-blown civil war.
Wow, a civil war. How long did that last?
Over 25 years. It was brutal.
So how did it finally end?
The Sri Lankan government eventually defeated the Tamil Tigers, this separatist group that wanted an independent Tamil state. But it really left its mark on Sri Lankan society, a lot of scars.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how does this all tie into Dasanayak?
Well, Dasanayake's Sinhalese himself and his party, the JVP, they have a history of Sinhalese nationalism. Understandably, that makes some Tamil people nervous. In fact, the main Tamil political party actually endorsed Dasanayak's opponent.
So he's got his work cut out for him if he wants to bring everyone together.
For sure. He's going to have to really reach out to the Tamil community, address their concerns if he wants to be successful.
Man, it sounds like Dasanayak's facing a perfect storm here. The economy's a mess, parliament's divided, and now you've got these deep-rooted ethnic tensions. How does he even begin to deal with all of that?
It's a lot, that's for sure. And then you add in the whole geopolitical side of things. Sri Lanka has always been in a tricky spot geographically.
Right, it's like right in the middle of everything.
Exactly. Major shipping lanes right in the
Mhm.
Indian Ocean. Plus, you've got India right there, practically next door, and then China trying to increase their influence in the region.
So how does Dasanayak's win play into all of that?
Well, that's the interesting thing. India's always been more comfortable dealing with those established parties, the ones who've been around forever. Dasanayake throws a bit of a curveball into that whole dynamic.
But India's not just sitting back and watching all this unfold, right? Didn't one of the articles mention something about them reaching out to Dasanayak pretty early?
They did. They actually invited him to India back in February, like months before the election even happened. I think they knew he was a serious contender. They wanted to start building a relationship early on. Smart move, really.
For sure. So do we have any clues about how Dasanayake is going to handle this whole India-China balancing act?
It's hard to say for sure, but he's going to need to reassure India that he's not going to just hand the reins over to China.
Especially with all the tension over those Chinese research vessels docking in Sri Lankan ports, right?
Yeah, exactly. That didn't go over well in Delhi at all.
But on the flip side, Dasanayake can't just ignore China either, can he?
Nope. He needs their investment to help rebuild the economy, and China's got deep pockets. Plus, there are already projects like that wind power plant, the one being developed by India's Adani Group, that could easily cause more friction with China down the line. It's a tough balancing act for sure.
Wow. So no easy answers for Dasanayake. He's got those domestic challenges. He's got to manage these international relations. And through it, all those expectations from the Sri Lankan people. They put him in charge. They're looking for real change.
And it'll be fascinating to see if he can pull it off. We've only scratched the surface here. But what we do know is Sri Lanka's at a crossroads. The decisions Dasanayake makes now, they're going to have huge implications for the country's future. It's a story that's still being written, for sure.
That's a great point to end on. It's definitely a situation we'll all be watching closely. Thanks so much for breaking all of this down for us. This has been a fascinating deep dive.
Anytime. Glad we can shed some light on this for everyone.
And to all of you listening, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll leave you with this. Can Dasanayake really change Sri Lanka? Or will he get pulled in by the same forces that have shaped the country for decades? Only time will tell.